Great. Well, now we can move on to the next presentation. So we are about to hear from John Burkhardt of the University of Michigan. John Burkhardt, before we get into his bio, helped in figuring out some of the last conference, helping me sort of think through how to organize the original conference. So he's become a friend and also helped us think through this idea of university cities as and through the lens of equity as well. We all live in cities that where there are benefits to having folks with BAs and above, as we've just heard from Shay. But that doesn't complete the view of the city. There are lots of folks that live in all of these cities that do not have BAs or above, and what are the impacts of this sort of new understanding of these cities on them? So John Burkhardt is a professor of clinical practice in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan. He also directs the National Forum on Higher Education for the Public Good, so research and policy effort focused on the relationship between higher education and society. So he's the right person to be hearing from today. In 2013 to 2016, John directed the National Center for Institutional Diversity. And prior to coming to the University of Michigan, he served as a program director for leadership and education at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So today, John is going to explore this question of whether university cities are island paradises or radiant stars.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Shay. That was terrific. And I want to also thank the mayor who had to leave and the university for hosting this, the Knight Foundation, and my fellow presenters. Thank you very much. I would like to start in a slightly different way, and I hope to not offend anyone. But if I do, this will be over in just about a minute and a half. Susie, are we ready?
Mm-hmm.
The voice of God.
Is the University of Michigan.
What a football game we're going to have here this afternoon.
You are looking live at a sold-out 103,000 Stadium in Ann Arbor.
The football game from Ann Arbor.
Nation will rock with
Listen to what Jones talks about, not the pictures, what he says.
Respect integrity and honor excellence.
The jubilation and cheering long into the night.
Here come the Wolverines.
We are loyal Wolverines.
Today, your football team is #1 in the country, and it's all right here.
Standing for Midwestern values, hard work, determination, and an enthusiasm unknown to mankind.
The old season is over. It's going to be Michigan.
We are
We're gonna
the
exit out of
best
this.
university in the world. Students and athletes and professors achieving at the highest level. This is our legacy
Okay,
and our
and our future. That's another way of thinking about this community, this place, this sense that we describe as a university city. It's important to know that on 5 Saturdays a year, 110,000 people flood into this stadium, and that the population of Ann Arbor in August is somewhere around 70,000. We have an infusion of outsiders into our community on a regular basis. And so when you think about what is Ann Arbor, and by extension, what are university cities, you might be inclined to think people. But these are different people. You could think geography, but as Scott has pointed out, when you examine the geography of these cities, it's an uneven parameter in many respects. What they might have in common is because of the interstate system, virtually all of our cities have a ring of expressways around them, and certain things happen within them that may not happen outside of them. In our analysis, we wanted to look not only at the great things that university cities are, which we celebrate and benefit from, but also the fact, if you click that there are many other things as well. And I don't have control of my, there you are. So they're fun, they're prideful, they're self-aware, they're economic, they're political, jurisdictional. I'm going to treat them as if they're also conceptual. And we're examining, if you will, this place, Ann Arbor, only as an example. And I can explain why we focused on one community. It should become clear. We did make some comparisons across the board, not with the sophistication that Shay's group did, but there are some phenomena that need to be examined under a microscope rather than a macroscope. Ann Arbor is often referred to, at least by people around the Midwest, as A squared, A2. And it's both a reference to the A in Ann Arbor, but it also has kind of a techy, edgy, smart feeling to it as well. I'm going to suggest it could stand for the complexity and the dualism that is part of this community and many others as well. Our question that we posed actually at the first conference, in advance of it, as we were planning it together, Scott, but also in our research, is would it change our thinking if we were to recognize and to document particular challenges grounded in inequities that are associated with these university cities? And we conducted this research in a particular context within the university and at this national forum where we look at the relationship between higher education and society. Much of our work is grounded in the social sciences and in economics, but you'll recognize from the use of this model that we draw heavily on sociology, anthropology, and other fields as well. We use an ecological perspective. So we're looking at institutions and communities, but also on effects on individuals, but also what it means for our society. And in this case, what does the university, broadly defined, mean? Is it an elite place walled off from the rest of us? Is it populated by a political perspective, which, by the way, is demonstrated in data? Is it something entirely different, a new species, as the language of this conference has suggested? Or is it part of American life, with all of the benefits and the challenges associated with that? We adopted the same parameters that were offered at the original conference. You're familiar with these. And I appreciate, Shay, that you've expanded on these and nuanced them. We looked at cities that had a similar DNA, and at the beginning we thought we would take the 6 cities that had been identified and drill down in each of them to try and see what could be learned. There were a number of reasons why that was difficult, and most of them are common to any contextually related research. There were differences between them, historical differences, geographic differences, and some of those were teased out brilliantly in your research. We had, in effect, boundary issues, and I'm a psychologist, so I have to work that into almost every presentation unless my mom's there. And but the boundary issues were of a scholarly nature, is that we couldn't define the phenomena under question in a way across all the cities effectively. Nonetheless, we were able to make some general comparisons as we looked more closely at Ann Arbor. You will recognize this, especially those of you with backgrounds in sociology, as not only a pretty concentric circles or overlapping circles, but an identity map, which is to say that our identities operate at all these levels simultaneously, and many others as well. You could introduce into this Catholicism, or a political affiliation, or I'm a member of Rotary. These are forms of identity, and we, in this research, just to give you our theoretical departure point, adopted these identities as the basis of what we then did next. You're familiar with the cities. What we did was look at them using a standard measure of inequality that's most frequently used internationally, and only occasionally applied to more narrow jurisdictions. This is the Gini Index. Are you familiar with it? Gini stands for that woman in a bottle that came out of that television show before Shay was born. No, it doesn't. Gini is gaps in national income, and it allows us to look at societies in terms of their level of differentiation economically. It's used by the United Nations and the World Bank, U.S. government agencies to consider income inequality. Interestingly, one group that uses it heavily is the Central Intelligence Agency. I wonder if you can speculate as to why they would care. Societies that have polarity economically are unstable for the most part. They're threatened, they're vulnerable, and more commonly are drifting towards some form of revolution, economic or political. So the Gini Index is one measure that we could point to, and if we go to the next slide, you'll see that across the world, nations differ in their level. Hit the next button, please, and others, in terms of the level of income disparity. South Africa being an outlier, perhaps what you would call the worst, if you believe that income equality is most important. Canada, interestingly, very close, part of North America, right, is got a low index. The United States, a relatively high index. And if you go to the next slide, we applied this same test to a number of the cities in consideration here. The Gini index for the United States is 45. Wayne County, which is the county in which Detroit is located, not Ann Arbor, is not located in Wayne County, 49.75, higher than the national average. Washtenaw County, which is Ann Arbor, high. Ann Arbor, high. And then Lexington, Fayette, Durham, Madison, Fort Collins, all of these above the national average in terms of income disparity within the communities. Lincoln at about the national average. And if you recall from the last slide, Russia is way off the bottom of the page. And in case you're interested, you can do that analysis for your own city. The formula is complicated, but fortunately it's been automated, so you can do it pretty quickly. Let's look at some of the ways in which this plays out. We took a look at a couple of university cities, and we differentiated between the universities that were located there. Duke, which is in Durham, the student median household income, now this is the student's family income originating, not what they're earning as students, presumably, is $186,000. 4 miles away, North Carolina Central University, the student median household income, $37,000. Both of them within the definition of a university city. Both of them within the geographic area we're talking about, but with very different student populations. If you look at interinstitutional comparisons between two university cities that many people would think have a lot in common, located where they are, and they're in the Big Ten, etc. The student median household income at Wisconsin-Madison is $95,000, which compares to the state average in Wisconsin of $56,000, much higher. But look at Ann Arbor. For all the nice things Shay said about Ann Arbor, our student population is dramatically different than our state population. And part of this is a reflection of a decision made at the university to admit just about 50% of our undergraduate population from out of state. So individuals, especially from New York, which doesn't have the same level of investment in public education traditionally, are bringing their resources to Ann Arbor. And our student income is way up here, our state income much lower, and as we're going to see in a minute, the income for those who live and work in Ann Arbor, lower too. Ann Arbor is the 8th most economically segregated city in the United States. And in our state of Michigan, our county, Washtenaw County, ranks 81st out of 83 in economic equality as measured in 2007. Washtenaw County is 4th in the state in terms of health outcomes, something to be proud of. And yet there's a 9-year difference in life expectancy between residents of Ann Arbor's 48104 zip code. Ypsilanti is the home of Eastern Michigan University, not a small institution in its own right. And its closest area zip code is 9 years difference in terms of life expectancy. You can go to the next slide. There's a great discussion within our city about what's happening with housing prices and affordability, as the previous presenter suggested. I made this presentation to our alumni association at Camp Michigania, which you got to go if you get the chance. It's beautiful. And when they learned that Ulrich's bookstore was being torn down to create a high-rise with concierge services and underground parking, there were tears in the room. And it suggests what is going on, at least around our institution, and I think other university cities might want to consider this, and at the end I'll give you some suggestions on how that could be done. Let's go to the next chart. For the next 2 or 3 charts in this series, we adopted Washtenaw County as a perspective to look at some differences, and Ann Arbor is located pretty much right here in the county. Now, this happens to be a calculated opportunity index where we combine educational level, job starts, access to capital resources, financial capital resources, issues of density. It's a pretty complicated factor, but it suggests where is this opportunity that we're associating with these cities? High opportunity places. And you'll see that there's quite a bit of variability within this county. One thing to realize, and this is one of the complications of doing research across communities, is that the density and population on this side is quite different than on the other side. And Detroit is over here, to give you some perspective, about 40 minutes away. But you can see that there's considerable differences even within this same community, which we would largely suggest is a representation of the university city of Ann Arbor. This is the same chart where we've broken it down by racial group. And the intersection of race and place is something that I want to elaborate on in just a second. In the next slide, we're looking at differences in growth. This is population growth over the course of the last several years. And as you can see, the population growth, this looks nearly identical to the opportunity index. The population growth is concentrated in and around Ann Arbor. Consistent with Shay's findings, people are staying, but is it gravitating to the entire region? Not hardly, and not to Detroit for the most part. The next chart. Are levels of school poverty low for all students? Now, most people who live in Ann Arbor, when you ask why they moved there, there's lots of different reasons, but they almost always say the schools. The schools are great. They're number one in the state. They're among the best in the country. But the poverty rate within the schools differs dramatically on the basis of individuals, people of color versus people not of color. And of course, we've lumped a number of different racial ethnic groups to create the upper line. But you can see, even within this fairly homogeneous city, the Ann Arbor School District, another problem with studying this, is not exactly coterminous with the city of Ann Arbor, or it moves in and out of the county, as a matter of fact. But within the Ann Arbor schools, you see these differences. How is growth distributed? We talk a lot about about the growth and opportunity and the opportunities for income. This chart looks at those who are working full-time and living 200% below or below the poverty level. And as you can see, once again, in this case, you kind of read the chart from the bottom up. The white level of growth is better, and as you move up into different racial groups, less good. Housing affordability. Here's an example of where the phenomena of the University City, the infusion of resources and increasing population density affects everyone, because all the housing in the area is going up, and it's actually going up. It's less affordable in the city itself than in the surrounding communities. But then when you play race against this, you can see it's going up for everybody, but different people are being disadvantaged to a greater extent. Do all workers earn a living wage? One of the observations that I made in making this presentation on campus is the very clear distinction between an individual like myself who takes pride in Ann Arbor and enjoys going to the football game, the cultural events, the many opportunities associated with it, but also recognizes the privileges that have come by virtue of my background and my affiliations, which are not available to staff for the most part. Brief digression, the provost sent me several years ago to study diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the Big Ten. And I landed in State College and had different conversations with different groups. In talking to the staff cohort there, virtually all of them were commuting into the city from outside of it, largely from white communities, untouched by the university's character in many respects, but serving the university, drawing their income from the university, but in fact, not unlike those who come to Ann Arbor for football Saturday, a very different group of people than the demography we typically associate with the institution. Are residents healthy? This is sobering data. For 9 years, I was chair of St. Joseph Mercy Hospital, which if it were located in any other community in the United States would be the flagship. It's a great hospital, part of a great system. But the University of Michigan health system is about 3 miles away. It's still a big hospital, but it has a different focus and mission. In that role, we were painfully aware that lower birth rates, higher death rates, and in this case, distribution of diabetes and asthma were not only associated with racial differences, and this is where I come back to saying you can't lift these cities out of the historical structures and traditions in which they exist and examine them as if those factors don't apply. So it is both race and place, because we can look at our community, Washtenaw County, and by zip code and neighborhood actually pin down where are the problems with birth weights, where is the diabetes, where are issues of lead. So in that respect, and I'm trying to speed through a lot of research here. I suspect you realize that. We felt we needed to disaggregate even again this community, and we started to parcel off parts of the Ann Arbor area and the Washtenaw County area to look at areas, in this case, for instance, south of Michigan Avenue, which travels east to west. It starts actually in downtown Detroit and ends in Chicago, once called the Old Indian Trail. And the experiences of individuals in Soma, south of Michigan Avenue, are different in terms of what they eat, their access to health care services and nutrition, and their housing than those north of that line. You probably have these same divisions in your own community, whether created by a railroad or a river or a jurisdictional plot or by traditional patterns of racial segregation. We did the same thing in the West Willow neighborhood, which is where Willow Run Airport exists. Willow Run was the great arsenal of democracy. It was the place in which we sent off all those planes. There's still an airport there. The West Willow neighborhood has a different health status and very different protections for children than Ann Arbor might. We also looked at data associated with a growing community in our area, the Latinx community, and want to acknowledge that that term combines many different racial ethnic groups as if they are one, and they're quite different. But we were able to look at some of the patterns there. And here again, you see the effect of broader societal influences. The fact that many of our Latino, Latinx residents don't have health care is at least partially explained by the fact that families don't register their children for CHIPs because of the concern about acknowledging their undocumented status. If we could go to the next chart, you'll see that these health indicators are quite different. This is comparing the average age of death, now aggregating the whole county again, white, black, Latino, 20 years difference. And the percent of Washtenaw County residents who are overweight or obese by race and ethnicity, white, black, Latino. Very tragically, the average age of death for black, white, and Hispanic residents of our county is quite different. And if we plotted this as we could against geography, you would see the differences are predominantly, here is Ann Arbor, and here's what surrounds it. This makes, well, there it is. That's what I was just trying to say. You can see the city itself, where the university is located, although the university is just about everywhere in southeastern Michigan now. And you can see the differences. This is Ypsilanti, where Eastern is. By the way, there are 7 colleges or universities within 8 minutes of each other in Ann Arbor. And next to Cambridge, Massachusetts, the largest concentration of college students anywhere in the United States. So when you're talking about a university or a college town, you're typically talking about multiple schools as well. So just a few implications for this, and then leave time for any questions you had. It's been calculated that if there were no racial gaps in income within Washtenaw County in 2014, the local gross domestic product would have been $1.8 billion greater. Now, we're not going to eliminate racial gaps, and I want to keep reminding us, I'm interspersing race and place in this analysis because I think they're largely inseparable, especially if you look at neighborhood patterns. So that's one implication of this kind of analysis, economic. The same kind of analysis would lead us to conclusions related to education, because education, of course, is one way in which the future inequities might be unraveled over time. in short, are any of you as old as I am and remember those true vision things you look through? And by looking through, thank you. And I know you did too, but you're not admitting it. By looking at two, and through two lenses, you get what looks like a three-dimensional view. I'm suggesting that we really need, in the context of this very important and helpful discussion, to look both across, as Shay's presentation said, but deeper within these cities to try and understand what really is going on, who's really benefiting. And for an individual, is that me? This is Gregorian chant.
It's nice.
It actually kind of works. It works for the conclusion.
Yeah, actually,
Soundtrack.
only my colleagues up here are hearing a beautiful Gregorian chant played here. Let me.
I liked it. I actually thought it was coming out of your slide.
It's coming out of my pants, as a matter of fact. But I crossed the line. So, and I can't get it to shut up. And I believe it or not, I kind of lost my point. We need to be looking across and within. And it's especially important if we're looking at issues of replication. If there's something in these university cities that's important enough that we should be applying it in many other places, it's quite possible, at least I hope, that maybe we could have some of the benefits while examining and maybe even changing some of the structures that have been replicated in the context of these cities. It's also very important, Scott made reference to the fact that for 3 years, I was director of a National Center for Institutional Diversity. Virtually every college and university that I spotted is also committed rhetorically and by mission and oftentimes by budget involvement to greater diversity, equity, and inclusion within the societies they serve. This has become one of the twin missions of higher education in our country. And I think people are going to be asking us, to what degree do those commitments play out in the communities that surround us? And research of this type might provide insights. And I cite those implications, and I could add to those economic, educational, practical, mission related, also demographic and moral, philosophical implications as well. So, how might it change your thinking if we're to recognize and document particular challenges grounded in inequities that are associated with university cities? And in fact, you can do this yourself. We will share our PowerPoint, and if you click one more slide to get to that, we did most of this work. We actually constrained ourselves to using sources that others could use as well, so that whatever insights we were able to draw were insights that other communities could examine. And I suspect it may lead you to different conclusions, but some of the same conclusions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We can take a question or two before moving on to the next presentation.
Shay's got
Oh, I got one.
Jay?
That was great. And one thing I would actually wonder, we've looked at it at our company before, and it tends to be really revealing. So if the universities themselves are going to play both a direct and an indirect role in shaping inequality, right? I mean, their existence brings students, their existence brings developers, their existence kind of creates an initiative housing crisis. But then there's also the outputs that they're more in control of, like who they hire, right, where they spend money on their goods and services, and that kind of stuff. So I was wondering have you done it yet for the University of Michigan? And it might be kind of an interesting thing to try to push to more members of the university cities, because it'd be interesting to see if if you looked at the University of Michigan's hiring patterns, would you find that it shares the same level of inequality that most of the employees at the University of Michigan are not necessarily people of color. The people of color who are working at the University of Michigan tend to be in lower wage positions that don't have access to growth, or where the University of Michigan spends its money on goods and services tends to be with majority companies or those.
I would say that those I don't want, those considerations are very much at work in our policy making.
Okay.
And the thought that our persons of color are concentrated in lower income jobs is not accurate. It's not accurate. It's bimodal. We do have a huge hospital, and it attracts individuals for faculty and staff, physician positions from all over, and so we have. We're proud of the diversity that exists at the upper levels of our hospital system and so on. And then you'll find another concentration in support services jobs. So it's a bit more bimodal.
Gotcha.
In that respect. Our contracting activities are under close public supervision, and Ann Arbor, for all the other things that might be said, Ann Arbor is a place where privilege is examined routinely. And so this kind of conversation goes on all the time.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the same company that's been providing us with bleachers since the 1920s isn't still privileged by virtue of past association. And we're far from perfect in any way, but we are trying to align our policies and our spending decisions and our hiring decisions with this kind of analysis.
Yeah, and I didn't just mean University of Michigan. I think it's a broader conversation for the
Across the
university
board.
and cities in general. Because
Right.
if they're causing it inadvertently, I mean, no one. It's not like the University of Michigan opened up and said, "We want to have an impact that's going to create inequality in our
right.
city," but their existence did. So what do they have? What can they influence directly to potentially
Well,
offset?
my
that?
wife and I argued from about Dayton to here about whether this is really part of the university's responsibility. And when I spoke to the alums, they were pretty adamant that whether they were right or wrong, the University of Michigan is a meritocracy. Now, if you speak to your alums, they will also tell you that a meritocratic phenomenon occurred and they were lifted up by it for their special quality and hard work. Why? Who would want to think otherwise, right? So any hint of socialism creeping into that is the kind of thing that you'd expect from a university tenured professor. And so there's good disagreement as to whether the university has a role in resolving these inequalities. In fact, they're perpetuating them in part, not by design, as you point out, by the fact that they keep paying higher wages than any place else around, that the University of Michigan is not only the largest employer in the county, but the largest employer in the state. And believe we're in a state where General Motors and Ford once predominated. And that in order to get the kind of diversity we want on our faculty, we are paying top dollar. It's an interesting, a little bit off your point, we are competing in some ways with Wisconsin and Ohio State and Michigan State on a football field, but for faculty, we're competing with other institutions with great resources, Stanford, Harvard, and so on, unwilling to lose either of those competitions, but resigned to losing the earlier ones more often than is desirable. We are fighting to create this, this city on a hill. But I think your point is, for someone who studies higher ed in society, it's a very tough argument that the university, prosperous as it is, with all the contributions it makes, should somehow be using its resources to solve a problem that I would argue is rooted in many things, including the history of our country. So I want to be careful not to move towards a polemic on this issue, which I clearly could,